Today we're going to look at a paper that was published in the Journal of Sport Science and Medicine. The paper was titled Effective Load on Peak Power of the Bar, Body, and System During the Deadlift. If we put on our thinking caps and we actually think back and remember what it feels like to deadlift light weights and to deadlift heavy weights, without reading the paper, we can probably definitively state that light weights can be moved faster and heavy weights will always have to move slower. It's the nature of the universe. If we remember high school physics and some of our equations, power equals work over time. At the light end of this equation, at the light end of this experimental arrangement, with light weights lifted, power is going to be lower. And on the heavy end of the equation, or weights lifted, power is also going to be lower. Peak power is going to be somewhere in the middle. Now, the goal of this particular experiment was to find out precisely, or within about a 10% span of numbers, where the peak occurs for 22-year-old males who could deadlift on average 203 kilograms. That's about 447 pounds. Now, a nice touch here within this experiment was the discrimination and combination of the bar's movement, description of the body's movement, and description of the combined system movement. But in reality, once we grab a bar, we're part of a system. So we only really needed the system data. But it is informative to know what the various contributions to power output are. Now, this is a student-led paper. And that's, once again, it's a commended approach. Researchers learning their craft and putting it out there for review and for commentary. Well, in this case, it's well controlled and the data seems pretty clean, although there were only 8 subjects included, meaning it's a very small scale study, so its application or its ability to generalize it to other populations beyond this particular young age and strong individual is sort of limited. Now, if we look at their velocity data, let's pull velocity data up and just a graph representing it. It's exactly what we would expect. If you add more weight, the weight goes up more slowly. If you look at the axis to the left, that's the peak power, peak velocity. And on the bottom, you see the percentage of one repetition maximum, or how much they can actually lift, with 100 being 403 pounds. And on the other end, 30% would be 132 pounds. All right. Now, at the low end, so this is pretty nice data. So if you look at the left axis and you look at the velocity, the highest velocities, you're looking at a velocity of about 1.5 meters per second. Now, this low-end velocity data is going to be likely inaccurate, as if an individual who can deadlift 203 kilos is asked to deadlift 60 kilos, that magic 30% load, and that would probably extend to the 40% load and maybe 50% load. If they're asked to do that as fast as they can, they will be going airborne unless they decelerate or move at submaximal speeds. If you think about the velocity, that movement velocity that we see in a snatch, power clean, we're seeing velocities with much heavier weights of 2.2 to 2.7 meters per second. So these people either are very, very slow movers or there is a problem with their data or with their methodology at this low end. Okay. Now, if we look at their force data, let's pull that up. This too is almost exactly as we would expect. If you add weight, it requires more force to lift the weight. And so if we look over here at the far left axis, that's how much force is required. And along the bottom here, you see the percent of one repetition maximum, or how much they can lift, with 100% being the 403 pounds and the 30 being the 132 pounds. Okay. This seems fairly typical of everything we've ever seen before. Now, if we combine those graphs, this one goes up and the other one goes down, you can sort of predict what's going to happen. So let's pull up the power graph. Now, we again see what's generally accepted as normal, with peak system power occurring at about 70% of maximum. So we see go down across the bottom axis to 70 and look up, and you'll see that's where the peak occurred. Now, 70% of max is 142 kilos. That's roughly about 313 pounds, 314 pounds. If we think about the tons and tons and tons of empirical observations that coaches have had over the centuries, we know that somebody that can deadlift about 400 pounds, if they know basic clean technique, they can essentially clean 300 pounds. So this data that we were being presented with here is not very novel, but it is in the scientific world where we often have very simple questions that are unanswered. It's a nice addition because it actually describes what happens when we do things. Now, overall, we aren't really discouraged by the experiment yet. The data seems pretty clean. The data seems pretty nice, well thought out. Methodology and controls, pretty darn good. It's not until we get to the interpretation of the results that we start to see a problem. How a researcher interprets and makes recommendations about his data in application to the real world is a critical part of any paper. And in this case, they're specious. That simply means that they sound good, but they lack substance. Specifically, they say that, and I will quote verbatim, these loads may have training implications as athletes that accelerate their own body mass would be interested in body or system power and would load the deadlift at times with only 30 to 70% of 1 RM. A throwing athlete or weightlifter might be more interested in bar power and would thus at times perform the deadlift with a 50% 1 RM load. So, right off the bat, they say that all athletes that accelerate their own body mass, and that means all athletes of all types, since I'm not aware of any sport that does not require the athletes who partake in it to accelerate their bodies. So all athletes require the inclusion of the deadlift at times in their training in the range of 30% to 70% of max. Okay, we'll get to this a little bit more in detail in a minute. And then we have throwing athletes and weightlifters with a separate recommendation because they're not included in this overall athletic group. They're in a subgroup. There's no clear explanation in this other than it seems that the researchers apparently believe that since weightlifters lift bars, they should be more interested in the bar rather than the system. As I said earlier, once you grab a bar, you're part of that system. It's the system results that matter. Now, and then throwers. Why are throwers pulled out? Or why are they included in this subgroup too? And why is the recommendation that they should go to 50% of deadlift 1RM for training purposes? Why they should use a lighter weight than the general athlete? Because throwers and lifters are both strength athletes, and so in general they move and work at the higher end of the weight spectrum. Well, there's no explanation of this. There's no support for this recommendation in their paper or in other papers, and this is a tremendously bad recommendation. Can, based on this data, anyone say that deadlifting 50% of max at any velocity can improve snatch or clean and jerk performance? No, we can't. Not based on this data. Can we say that 100-meter time, mile time, steeplechase, 50-meter swim, target accuracy, or any other aspect of athletic performance be improved by occasionally deadlifting 30% to 70% of max? No. Where is the evidence in this paper or others? This is pure speculation that is unsupported from the data. Now, interestingly and notably, powerlifters are absent from the recommendations here. Powerlifters use the deadlift. So if we're investigating the deadlift, isn't it important to consider the people that compete in the deadlift event as part of their sport? Not addressed here. And what about the millions of people that use the deadlift in training for fitness? Do we have any recommendations for those people in this as well? The authors don't even attempt it. So we see some fairly large holes in in recommendations towards application. They're not based in reality, and they're not based in the data, and they are incomplete. Now, in general, we lift weights to get stronger. That's what we do. And in sports and in work applications, that's how we actually generate more power. We increase the weight moved. That means we work progressively heavier. Since we only have a finite ability to improve neural conduction speed and improve response time by getting stronger, we can increase power. By using submaximal weights, we don't get stronger. We don't disrupt homeostasis to drive the adaptation of strength. So while we commend the student researchers here for their conduct of a small-scale experiment, are the recommendations for using the data as described, if implemented, likely to improve fitness and performance in anyone other than ranked beginners? No.